Friends, I'd like to do something a little different today. I'd like to begin today by inviting you to get the hell out of the church. Now, wait, before you go anywhere, just please hear me out for a second. In fact, I'd like you to get the hell out of your lives. I'd like you to get the hell out of the world. What am I talking about? Of course, I'm talking about evil in the world. I'm talking about evil that tries to find a home within our hearts, our minds, our actions, our living, our choosing, our doing. Before you go home and say, well, that preacher used H-E double hockey sticks in his sermon, I'd like you to remember what I'm talking about is our vulnerability to evil, our vulnerability to the temptations and the power of the devil, Satan, Lucifer, whatever term you want to use. I want to talk to you about protecting ourselves by naming some of those things that we unwittingly choose, those things we unwittingly do that make us susceptible and vulnerable to the very dark and powerful forces of evil in this world. Today's the first Sunday of Lent. And as I mentioned before the readings, we always begin Lent with Jesus in the wilderness. Jesus has been baptized. He's been affirmed by his Father in heaven. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am pleased. And so Jesus goes into the wilderness. Depending on which text you're reading, he goes perhaps by choice, led by the Spirit. In another text, he's driven to the wilderness. Either way, he's there for 40 days of fasting, of prayer, of discernment. And the Scriptures say during those 40 days, he is tempted by the devil. The dark, powerful forces of the king of hell come to Jesus and try and tear him down. Most often we begin Lent talking about the wilderness. You know, you've got wilderness and you got the devil, you got wilderness, you got temptation. We usually try and soften it up, particularly in the Protestant church. We like to talk about the wilderness because we've all been to the wilderness, right? We've all experienced some wilderness times in our lives. Well, this year I want to talk to you about the other side of the coin. I want to talk to you about the devil, a thing we don't talk about very often in the church, ironically. Before we talk about those three things, there are many, but I'm only going to talk about three today, particularly because of time, but I'm going to try and lift up three things I think we do that make us vulnerable to the devil, and then hopefully in naming those we'll empower ourselves. We'll find tools for protecting ourselves against Satan, who wants to make a home in our hearts, in our thoughts, and in our lives. But before we go there, I want to maybe take a humble attempt at defining evil. Now, I say a humble attempt because people, of course, have written books on this subject. Reams and reams of paper and thought has gone into this. And I'm not going to, satisfy this answer in quick order. But I do think if we're going to talk about those things that make us vulnerable to evil, we might want to attempt a little bit of thinking about what evil is. St. Augustine once said, never try to fight evil as if it exists apart from yourself. He said, sometimes evil originates from within. Now, I'm not sure I entirely agree with St. Augustine, but he is St. Augustine, and who am I to argue? But I will say this, I believe God made you good. I believe God made all of us good. Yes, I believe we're born into a very sinful world. But I'm not sure God made you to be an originator of evil. St. Augustine saying it originates from within. I'm not sure it originates there, but I sure believe that it finds a home within us. I believe sometimes we act in ways that are evil because evil has found its way into our hearts, into our thinking, into our lives. Now, I tend to lean a little more to the modern American psychiatrist's understanding of evil. M. Scott Peck, Don't know how many of you have read his book, People of the Lie, Toward Hope for Healing Human Evil. Now, Scott Peck took a lot of heat from people in his academic circle. He's a psychiatrist, but he's also a Christian. Now, psychiatrists, at least the psychiatric profession, doesn't like to think of things in terms of good or evil, God or Satan. They like to think of psychosis and neurosis and mental illness. And Scott Peck, being a psychiatrist but also a Christian, said no. We need to attempt naming this thing if we're ever going to have any hope for overcoming it or healing it. And Scott Peck defined evil this way. He defined evil simply as that thing, that force in our universe that seeks to destroy human life. Anything that destroys us physically, anything that destroys us mentally, or anything that destroys us spiritually. That which tears down our humanity, which tears down the image of God within us in which we've been created. Anything that tears down our human love. That's evil, says Scott Peck. And he says evil doesn't have a consciousness. Evil doesn't know that it's evil. He said, but evil does need a home. And so evil, this dark, chaotic force, is always looking for a residence. It's looking for a place to pitch a tent. It's looking for a garden in which it might grow, or a human heart, a human life in which it might take up residence. So when I'm talking about evil today, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that force which seeks a home in your life, in my life, in our church, and in our world. That force that seeks to destroy the image of God in which I've been created and in which you've been created. That force which seeks to destroy the gift of love that really claims our humanity for us ultimately. The first thing we do, unwittingly, the first thing we do that makes welcome for Satan in our lives, blame. Blame. When we seek to absolve ourselves of our own choices, our own actions, by shifting blame to someone else, we make welcome for Satan in our lives. I'll show you what I mean. During the Second World War in Germany, in Nazi Germany, good, everyday Christian folks turned ugly. Every Sunday, go-to-meeting Christians started turning in their neighbors. Turning in their neighbors if they were Jewish. Turning in their neighbors if they were gay. Turning in their neighbors if they had disabilities, so that they could be put into boxcars and shipped off to concentration camps where they could be extinguished. Everyday good German soldiers started putting people into gas chambers and destroying millions and millions of lives. And during the trials for war crimes following the Second World War, do you know what the number one excuse was for this kind of behavior? Well, we were just following orders. We were just doing what we were told. Blame. It wasn't me. It was somebody else. Like the old 1970s television comedian Flip Wilson used to say, "The devil made me do it." But blame just makes welcome for Satan. Shifting your responsibility for your actions, your thinking, gives Lucifer a place to grow in your life. Now you may be saying, well, gosh, those people, their own lives were threatened. If they didn't turn in their neighbors, they could be executed. If the soldiers didn't march those people off to the gas chambers, they could be executed. Well, guess what? Sometimes to take responsibility for your actions, to stand up for what is right, for what is just, it may mean putting your life on the line. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise to us, should it? We've got someone we're very familiar with who did just that, and his name is Jesus Christ. When we blame others for our actions, we give Lucifer a home in our hearts, in our minds. Now you're saying, gosh, Mark, that's a pretty extreme example. That was World War II. That was many, many years ago. That sort of thing wouldn't happen in our day and age. Well, of course it would. And just like people in World War II said it couldn't ever happen, and it did happen. It happens over and over again, and we even see it in some smaller ways here in America. We see our politicians behaving that way. They say, look, if you're going to survive in politics, it's not me, but I can't keep the people happy because I got to keep the party happy. I've got to serve a super PAC. I got to serve some other power other than the people I was elected to serve. We see it in business, where people are keeping the man happy, right? And they're rewarded for it well. I served a church many years ago where a man came to me and said, Mark, I'm being sentenced next week. Probably will spend a great deal of time in prison. He did, 7 years. I said, what happened? He said, well, I was cooking the books for the company I served. And you know what? The company rewarded me for it. The company patted me on the back and said, look, you've increased our bottom line by taking advantage of some of these clients and by cooking the books. And he said, when I first did it, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I was in the presence of evil, and yet the company kept patting me on the back. Until one day, a switch was flipped. And I found myself not feeling sick anymore. In fact, I took a great deal of satisfaction. He said it was surprised. I found myself saying, if these people are that stupid to give me their money, then I ought to take a little bit of joy in taking it from them. Eventually, he was arrested and convicted and did 7 years in prison. One of the saddest days for him and the saddest days for me was the day his 14-year-old son was graduating from the 8th grade. And his now ex-wife, who had left him while he was in prison, came up to me and she said, Dr. Mark, can you help my son tie his tie? He needs his tie for graduation. About broke my heart. I thought, tying a tie, teaching your son, isn't that a father's job? But Dad was in prison. He'd shifted blame to the company. The company made me do it. They rewarded me for it. That's the way of business these days. He's out of prison now, thankfully. He's written a book and he's doing the circuit, talking to people about why you don't put blame on somebody else. Why putting blame on somebody else gives home residence for Satan in your life, and it's destructive to your family, it's destructive to your kids, it's destructive to your marriage, it's destructive to your faith community, and it's destructive to our world. Okay, second thing that makes us vulnerable to Satan in this world. Something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer once called rational compromise. Now, you're good Protestant folks here sitting in these pews. You're enlightened 21st century people. You're thinking, what's wrong with rational and what's wrong with compromise? Well, on the surface, not much. We should be rational folks. We should be logical. We should be good students when we have a question or we have something we need to know about it. We should study it. We should learn all that we can about something. When somebody sends us an email, a forward, we should check it out to see whether it's true or not before we forward it on to 100 of our friends or so. That's good rationale. And compromise, what's wrong with compromise? We all know that if you're going to be in relationship with anybody, whether it's a friendship or a marriage or a church family, compromise is necessary. I once heard somebody say, remember compromise this way, completion of a promise. Compromise. But what Dietrich Bonhoeffer wanted us to understand is sometimes you can rationalize and compromise the teeth right out of your own values. Sometimes you can rationalize and compromise the teeth right out of your own ethics. Sometimes you can rationalize and compromise your faith till it's gone, till you are paralyzed in the face of difficult decisions. I'm sure the good Christian folks of Germany found a lot of ways to rationalize why they were turning their neighbors in. I believe a lot of those soldiers found a way of saying, it's a compromise I make, that I ship these people off to the gas chambers to protect my own family. Sometimes we can rationalize and compromise ourselves till our ethics, our values, our faith have no teeth left. I think it was Yogi Berra who once said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. Too often we stand at the fork in the road of ethical challenges and we become paralyzed. Well, we say, well, I could go this way and that, or I could do this and that could, work out this way. And we're back and forth until finally we diminish the real issue, the hardcore ethical issue, and we do nothing. Rational compromise gives room for Satan to have his way in our hearts, our minds, and our lives. And we're a culture filled with rational compromise, aren't we? We're a culture that says everybody deserves an equal voice. And, I'm the first to protect our right of free speech. But sooner or later, we have to say no. As a matter of fact, not everybody does deserve an equal voice. I'll show you what I mean. You turn on the television set, and you're watching some sort of news program, whether it's network or cable news network, and there's two people on your television screen yelling at each other, right? They're arguing. They get an equal voice. And one of the people on the screen, well, let's say that person is a person whose parents survived the Holocaust. And because his parents survived the Holocaust, he has spent his life studying the Holocaust, studying evil, studying what happens to humanity when it compromises. This is a person who spent 10 years earning a PhD studying this very important part of our history, and has become an expert on it. He's got human suffering connected to it because it's in his family. He spent years studying it, writing it, speaking on it. And on the other side of the screen, equal voice, same size speaking head. Everything's equal is some nut job from one of the flyover states who swears the Holocaust never happened. Rational compromise. Everybody deserves an equal voice. You know what? I think the people of God need to sooner or later, no. Not everybody deserves an equal voice. Those who abuse children don't deserve an equal voice. Those who are breaking down our society don't need an equal voice. Rational compromise takes the teeth out of our values, our ethics, and our own faith until we do nothing, until we let Satan take over. Till Lucifer starts growing in the garden of our hearts. I say it's time to do a little weeding of the garden. Yes, we can be rational people. Yes, we can make compromise. But not everyone deserves an equal voice. Jesus, had he made rational compromise, he would have bought into Satan's temptations there in the wilderness. All of it made good sense, right? Jesus, you have been fasting for 40 days. You're hungry. Why not turn this rock into some bread? That's not such a bad thing, is it? But that's the thing with rational compromise. You can find yourselves choosing things that appear to be good, and when you do, you overlook the things that are better and ultimately best. Deciding between good and evil would be great if it was that black and white, but it's usually a choice between good and better, or better and best. And Jesus was not willing to make rational compromise with the devil there in the wilderness. No, I have a higher purpose, a higher plan, and I'm not willing to compromise it away, no matter how difficult it is. Okay, the last thing, and I said there are many, but I'm only talking about 3 today, but this third one is perhaps makes us the most dangerous, gives Satan the most room and most power in our lives if we're not aware of it. That third thing, denial. When we deny the existence of evil or deny the existence of Satan in this world, we become very dangerous people. Now, I know we are all bright, enlightened, scholarly folks sitting in the pews these days, and we tend to think about evil as a concept, or perhaps evil is the absence of good, and only with evil can we know what... Come on. As long as we deny the existence of evil, it has its way. It has its power. I remember talking with this guy years ago who said, Mark, I have to tell you, I don't believe in God. I said, well, that's cool. That's all right. I'm okay. Hey, it's your issues with God, not with me. Relax. And trust me, if God needs you to believe it, God will find a way. But do me a favor. Don't question the existence of Satan. You can question the existence of God, but never question the existence of Satan. Don't question Satan's existence in your own life or in this world. And especially don't question his potential in the body of Christ, in the church. Martin Luther said the devil has no better hiding place than in the church. Now, I feel very blessed. I'm with a very healthy congregation, and I want to keep it that way. So let me tell you that Satan has a way of hiding behind the wall, the pious walls of the church. Satan thinks this is a pretty good garden to set down roots. And if we're not willing to talk about that potential, we are vulnerable. My beloved Beth and I lived through probably the 16 worst months of our 28 years of marriage, our 25 plus years of ministry, in a time when a congregation denied the powerful presence of evil within our midst. We are being torn down by someone you would never expect it from. Someone who was holding secret meetings on how to destroy the new pastor. Somebody who is passing letters and secret lies and making up stories about the new pastor. Guess who it was? It was the former pastor. People said, "Oh, no, he would never do that. He's a Christian. He's a pastor." What was it St. Augustine said? Never question evil as if it existed entirely apart from yourselves. Sometimes it originates from within. We experienced it firsthand. And our worst enemy, our denial of it. We sat through session meeting after session meeting trying to untangle the chaotic knots that evil was tangling up in our congregation, and nobody could see it because nobody was willing to admit that, hey, yet while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We forget that, don't we? That we're still sinners. Christ died for us not because we stopped sinning, not because we are clean and safe from evil, not because we are not vulnerable. No, yet while we had all that stuff going on, he died for us. Like I said, we have a very healthy congregation, and I want to keep it that way. Do you remember the story of the two wolves? That young Indian brave is talking to the chief, his mentor, and he's talking to him about the powers of good and evil in the world. And the chief says to that young warrior, he says, "Son, within every one of us are these two wolves. One is good, one is evil, and these two wolves are always battling. Throughout our entire lifetime, the wolf of good will battle the wolf of evil. The wolf of evil will battle the wolf of good." And the young warrior says to the chief, "Well, which wolf wins the battle?" And the chief says, "That depends. Which wolf do you feed?" I want us to feed the good wolf in this congregation. I want you to feed the good wolf in your life. The only way we can feed the good wolf is to know how and when we are susceptible to the bad wolf. It's to be aware of those ways we unwittingly give room for Satan to pitch a tent in our backyard, for Satan to take up root in our hearts and our minds. You know, I think the simplest way to protect ourselves is also the hardest way. We're called to live our lives standing next to the cross of Jesus Christ. Before all our decisions, before all our choices, before all our ethical conundrums, we are asked to hold up the cross of Jesus Christ. Not just the open tomb of Easter, but that selfless, dying act of Jesus Christ on Golgotha, that human compost heap so long ago. How does my choice measure up to that cross? How does my action measure up to that cross? How does my thinking, how does my loving, how does my living measure up to that cross of Jesus Christ? I started off today by saying I wanted to invite you to get the hell out of the church and out of our lives and out of this world. Seems to me the best way to do that is to live our lives next to the man who went to the cross, to descend into hell, to rescue those who'd been taken down. He who died on the cross to defeat it once and for all. Praise be to God. Amen.